culture, power, and identity inform the interpretation of specific texts from a reader's perspective? This question is the focus in Sounding of Cultural Criticisms, which is a collection of essays that interpret scripture from a particular social location/context, page 4. This book assumes that most introductory textbooks are written by white authors that fail to raise the concerns of, quote, real readers related to culture, power, and identity. Well, you might be wondering, if cultural criticism is not the top priority for white scholars who represent the majority of the Guild, then what implications does cultural criticism have for preaching in this postmodern era? But more specifically, how can the D-Min student benefit from using cross-cultural methods in his or her church context? I believe that congregations and churches will benefit when preachers learn how to embrace cultural criticism for sermon preparation. Cultural criticism should produce a more authentic and relevant interpretation of Scripture so that the hearer can better relate to the preacher's message after seeing how the text applies to their own lives. This anthology is an attempt to address real readers' concerns in terms of race, ethnicity, class, and/or sexual identity. It addresses culture, power, and identity in biblical interpretation from a global perspective, and it is written on a comprehensive textbook level, covering a wide range or representative range of New Testament books and, quote, traditional interpretive questions. Whereas the Guild has come short on fulfilling the concerns of minority readers, this collection of essays hopes to fill that gap. Now, I'd like to talk about critically engaging the book. Greg Carey's essay on culture, power, and identity in the White New Testament Study states that whiteness functions as an attempt to define other groups as non-white without subjecting white identity itself to critical reflection, page 8. Therefore, white identity is not based on the critical reflection of white people, but is derived based on how whites see themselves in relationship to other minorities. If identity influences the way in which one interprets the Bible, then how does the lack of affirming or acknowledging one's identity impact their ability to faithfully and authentically interpret the Bible? If white identity is not subject to self-definition, then what basis or standard does white supremacy stand on? And what implications might the lack of identity have on white preaching? Without a clear identity established, the myth of white superiority falls apart. But more importantly, if God's people don't know who they are, then how can they see themselves in the Holy Scripture? Perhaps that's one reason why white preachers tend to be less emotional in general than black preachers. Whereas white preachers identify themselves, whereas black preachers identify themselves in the Bible with the oppressed and with the God who is able to liberate the oppressed from oppression, white preachers may not as easily identify themselves with the biblical narrative. So who do whites personally identify with in Scripture? And what is the God of their Bible look like? Self-identification can offer a new freedom to white preachers and congregations from the guilt and spiritual wounds of racism inflicted upon the oppressed and the oppressor. Once set free, white preachers can begin to envision and proclaim a prophetic message of inclusivity and liberation. Now, in multiple locations, Eleazar S. Fernandez states that our identity is subject to change based on a particular location, social, economic, political, or geographical, etc. Fernandez moved from the Philippines to America and has shifted his identity from a Filipino to a person of color, a racial ethnic minority. He states, I am not always and everywhere the oppressed racial minority. Well, I agree that identity is impacted by a change in geopolitical location, but I believe that the degree of change varies between ethnic groups. Whereas Fernandez did not experience minoritization until he came to the U.S. African Americans are subject to discrimination globally in one form or another, even in the White House. Fernandez's main point is that these multiple locations differ in power and therefore inform his approach to reading text. His central claim is, my reading strategy operates in the spirit of liberation discourse and is committed to emancipatory praxis intended to allow muted voices to speak. This type of reading is both liberating and empowering for prophetic preaching that imagine and proclaim not what is, but what is possible through the power of God. Fernandez also mentions the Exodus narrative when the divine promised land is intricately linked with the extermination of indigenous people. The Exodus narrative challenges me because I see myself linked geographically with the Egyptian oppressors and at the same time theologically associated with the oppressed white slave. And Psalm 105:23 further complicates the issue, where the Egyptians are called to be in the land of Ham, which establishes a definite link between the Egyptians and the people of African descent. Lastly, the Bible has many texts related to multiple geopolitical locations, especially those texts referring to the diaspora. This provides an excellent preaching possibility for cultural critical interpretations and sermon preparation of the Israelite-Palestine conflict. Here, next, I'll give you 3 questions for critical engagement for the students. Question 1. If the white preachers fail to do critical self-reflection on the scripture regarding the white identity component, what implications do you think this might have on the personhood and on the effectiveness of white preaching for whites and or minority groups? Question 2. Who has the right to hoop? And do you think it's okay for other racial ethnic groups to learn or adapt hooping as a technique to close their sermons? Why or why not? And the last question. Considering the responsibility of your personal/denominational ministry, what are your thoughts and feelings about keeping the Sabbath? And how does your answer relate to your culture, identity, and power as a preacher of the gospel message? That is the end of my presentation. I hope I said something that was enlightening. God bless you.